What's good, everyone? So today I wanted to show you in depth how you can take garbage photos and with just a few simple clicks in Lightroom, turn them into absolute bangers for your Instagram feed. Well, not quite. In fact, for having a good edit, it's actually super important to shoot properly, particularly exposing correctly, but also shooting in a RAW format, which preserves more detail than a JPEG and allows you to have more editing flexibility. To edit my photos, I use primarily Adobe Lightroom, which is a great photo editing software that gives you a lot of powerful tools, almost everything you need for editing a great photo, and is also great for sifting through and editing a large batch of a ton of photographs. I'm also going to be using a little bit of Photoshop to add some extra effects that you can't do in Lightroom. And with all of that being said, photo editing is of course entirely subjective, and these are just going to be the techniques and tools that I use to go for kind of a natural film look, you could say, that you see in my Instagram feed. If you don't follow it, at Aidin Robbins, right over there. As an example, I'm going to be using this drone photo I took a few weeks ago because I used just about every technique I would ever use to edit an Instagram photo on this one image. So I think it should serve as a pretty good example of the techniques I use. I'll start out with just some basic color correction, fixing the exposure, bringing back some detail in the highlights and shadows, correcting the white balance, basically just fixing everything I messed up while I was out shooting. And then I'll straighten the image and crop it to 4:5 dimensions. It's good to use 4:5 for Instagram because this way it's gonna fill up more of the screen when someone's looking at it on their phone than it would be able to if it were 16:9 or a square. Then I'm gonna scroll down a bit to the curves tool and just use this, depending on whatever the image needs, to add the right amount of contrast and just make the image pop a bit more. If we keep scrolling down, we'll see the HSL adjustments, where we can adjust the hue and saturation of individual colors in the image. And this is how you're gonna get the tones. If you want people commenting on your post about the sick tones, how great the tones were, love the tones, this is how you do it. On almost every image I edit, I'll desaturate the green and the yellow to make the image a bit moodier and give it more of that desaturated vibe. And lately, since it's getting into the winter season, I've also been shifting the green to be a bit cooler, just cooling it off to have less of that warm summer feel to it and more of a wintry, Christmassy type feel to it. I'll also desaturate the blue and shift it to be more of a teal color and just kill the magenta and purple entirely, because in most images you really don't need them. They show up mostly in grain or just like muddy parts of the image, like chromatic aberration around the edges. So I think in most cases it's best to just kind of get rid of it. And then all that's really left is the orange and red parts of the image, which I'll tweak depending on the image and the style I'm going for to have a nice warm tone popping out of that image. After that, I like to use gradients to draw the eye to the center of the frame. A lot of the time I'll add a gradient at the bottom of the image to darken that bottom part of the frame and draw the eye upwards to where the subject is. For this particular photo, I used gradients in a slightly different way as well, where I added one in the top corner to enunciate the clouds in the image and draw the eye to the center that way. So I drew that gradient on in the top left corner and then used it to pop the highlights to make that cloud more apparent, and I also brought down the clarity and the dehaze sliders quite a bit to really blur that part of the image out and add what you might want to refer to as fake fog into that part of the image. Now comes the interesting part of the video, where we crack this image open in Photoshop. I'm gonna start out by using the clone stamp tool and content aware fill options in Adobe Photoshop to clean up some unwanted details and get rid of some things that might be distracting in the image. Then I'm gonna use the dodge and burn tool to enunciate parts of the image a little bit more. Basically what this tool allows you to do is brighten or darken certain parts of the image using a brush, like the highlights, midtones, or shadows. So what I'll usually do is find an area that I think needs to stick out a bit more, that might be a bit hazy, and I'll go in and I'll use the dodge tool to brighten the highlights and then use the burn tool to darken the shadows. This is just another way to even out the levels of contrast in your image and draw the eye to that subject just a little bit more. Then, depending on the image, I'll correct the colors of specific parts of the frame just a little bit more. So for this particular example, I wanted the bridge to have less of a gray color to it and more of like an earthy brown color in the wood. So what I did was I added a blank layer over my image and then used a brown brush to just paint over the shape of the bridge. Then I just set that layer to an overlay blend mode and adjusted the opacity to tint the entire bridge that brown color. Those techniques are all entirely situational, and there's actually a lot of images I post that I haven't done any of that to, but one thing I'll use Photoshop for on just about every single photo I edit is diffusing the highlights. If I've done any previous edits and have a bunch of different layers in Photoshop, I'll merge them all together so that we just have one single layer, and then I'll use the color range tool to select the brightest parts of that layer. Then just hit Command J on your keyboard to lift those highlights onto a separate layer and use a Gaussian blur to blur them out. Then you can just go back and adjust the opacity depending on how harsh you want the effect to be. This is definitely a stylistic preference, but if you have blown out overexposed highlights in your image, this is a great way to smooth them out and make them look a little bit nicer in that picture. And finally, before we bring this image back into Lightroom and make some final tweaks, I'll add a curves adjustment over the entire composition and use it to take a bit of red out of the shadows. This way we're adding a little bit of a bluish, tealish tint to the darker parts of the image. I find this adds a bit of color contrast into it, so those warmer highlights pop off of those cooler like blue shadows, but I think it also makes the green parts of the image look very rich while still being desaturated. Anyway, let's pop back over to Lightroom to make some final tweaks to the image before we export it and post it on Instagram to get a million kajillion likes. All I really do after the image has made it safely out of Photoshop is sharpen it up a bit using Lightroom, and then also use Lightroom's noise reduction feature if necessary. Even if there's just a little bit of noise in certain parts of the image, Lightroom's noise reduction is actually surprisingly powerful and can do a great job of reducing that and smoothing the image out without making it look blurry or, you know, look like you used a noise reducer on it. Then, since I'm on a Mac, I'll just airdrop the image to my phone to get ready to post it in my feed. Once the image has made it to my phone, I use a nifty little app that allows me to preview it in my feed before I actually post it publicly. This allows me to see how the image looks in my feed and any additional adjustments I might have to make to it work. If I need to make more tweaks for it to vibe with my feed, I'll occasionally go back to Lightroom, but most of the time, I must admit, I just do it in the VSCO app. Say what you will. At this point, if you followed all those steps correctly, you can go ahead, post that photo in your feed, and you're guaranteed to get a ton of likes and comments, and everyone will like you. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but I hope you enjoyed this video or learned a new technique or two from it. If you don't already follow me on Instagram, feel free to do so at Aidin Robbins. I'm currently just finished up posting a ton of fall photos and am now moving into the winter feed. So if you want to follow along with that exciting journey, feel free to do so. But that being said, if you enjoyed this video or learned something new from it, feel free to show your support by leaving a like on the video, sharing it with your friends, or even subscribing to my channel for new filmmaking tutorials every week-ish. But that's all for this one. Keep creating, and I'll see you in the next video.